Hello, my name is Lysa Dealtry and I'm a lecturer in education at Sturt University, located on the sovereign lands of the Wiradjuri peoples. My presentation is titled Being Aboriginal, Australian Aboriginal Children's Voices During the Early Years of School. And today I'll be presenting some data and findings from my doctoral research. I would like to start by acknowledging the sovereignty of all of the First Nations represented on this map and pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. In particular, I acknowledge that the research I'm sharing today was undertaken on Tharawal lands in New South Wales, represented within the black circle on this map. The research community is located in urban southwest Sydney, and this urban location of the research site is significant as this research was the very first Australian research project to partner with an Aboriginal community in an urban location. And I wish to acknowledge all of the children, families, teachers, elders, and community members who shared their stories and contributed their wisdom and experiences in the research. I'm a non-Aboriginal researcher, so I respectfully acknowledge that I speak as an outsider when it comes to Aboriginal matters and knowledges. Throughout this presentation, the word Aboriginal has been used to refer to the participant children, and this reflects local preferences in the research site, as well as the protocol established for education contexts in New South Wales. My doctoral study formed part of a project titled Godiga Goes to School, an ecological study of school transition and the early years of school for Aboriginal children in an urban community. Through the presentation, I'll refer to this study as Godiga Goes to School. The Godiga Goes to School was funded by an Australian Research Council Discovery Grant awarded to the University of New South Wales. And I wish to extend my thanks to the team of researchers from the University of New South Wales listed here on this slide, as well as my PhD supervisors, Professors Sue Dockett and Bob Perry, who are from Sturt University. Godiga Goes to School builds on the work of a longitudinal study called the Godiga Study, and the word Godiga means healthy baby in the Tharawal language. The Godiga Study was established in 2007, and it evolved from a lengthy period of community consultation and many conversations among Aboriginal community members, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal health professionals and researchers. One of the great strengths of the Godiga Study is the time that was taken to build trusting relationships through yarning about community concerns and how best to address them. Many cups of tea and yarns under the gum trees at the local community centre led to a community-initiated and led project. So I'm hoping that the image on this slide will convey the relationships between the Godiga Study, the Godiga Goes to School study, and then my own doctoral study, which was an embedded project within the Godiga Goes to School project. I introduced the Godiga Study on the previous slide, and now I'll detail the Godiga Goes to School study further. So the Godiga Goes to School study commenced in 2011 as the Godiga children and families were preparing to start school, which they did in 3 cohorts over the course of 2011 to 2013. At the time, the Godiga children numbered 125. Quantitative data was collected for all 125 children, and qualitative data was collected for 43 focused children. The Godiga Goes to School study brought the original Godiga research team together with education researchers, and it was a funded doctoral student position in the Godiga Goes to School study that provided my entry point into researching with Aboriginal communities. My doctoral project was primarily concerned with children's sense of self as they started school, and I employed narrative analysis of the qualitative data gathered by the Godiga Goes to School team, and I focused on the self-related narratives of children, their mothers, and their educators. As a non-Aboriginal researcher coming alongside Aboriginal peoples in research, it is important that I share a little about how I aimed to conceptualise sense of self in culturally appropriate ways. While I could talk about this at great length, in this presentation I want to highlight that various theoretical frameworks, concepts and terms of reference were married together to inform the conceptual framework. One of these was Bronfen, Brenner and Morris's bioecological theory, which was employed in the Gadigal Goes to School study. Another was the cultural interface, which comes from the work of Torres Strait Islander scholar Professor Martin Nakata. Conceptualizations of self and ways of knowing the self from Aboriginal scholars Professor Aileen Morton-Robinson and Dr. Karen Martin also informed sense of self as existing in relatedness to elements of the physical, spiritual and human world, as fluid over the life course and as knowable through individual and collective stories and narratives of relatedness. To represent how the children in the study expressed a positive sense of self as a marker of successful transition to school, my analysis focused on statements made by children that included personal and collective pronouns as representations of self. And I framed these statements collectively as narratives of being. Children's self-related statements reflected three narratives of being with others, being a learner and being an Aboriginal child. And it is the third narrative, being an Aboriginal child, that I will turn to now. Children's narratives about their sense of being Aboriginal came about through their comments and stories when they were intentionally shown the Aboriginal flag during interviews. For 13 of the 17 participant children in my doctoral study, the Aboriginal flag prompted them to speak about their experiences and understandings about being Aboriginal. 4 of the 17 children did not identify as Aboriginal or with the Aboriginal flag when it was shown to them. Typically, the conversations that were generated by the Aboriginal flag related to children's expressions of their sense of being Aboriginal and what the flag or what being Aboriginal meant to them. In terms of sense of self and the self-related statements that I analysed, both personal and collective expressions of cultural identity were shared by the children, indicating that salient features of children's sense of self were a personal sense that I am Aboriginal and accompanying expressions of belonging to a cultural group that has a shared identity. The selection of quotes on this slide are representative of the types of comments children shared across their first 3 years of school. And these comments in particular highlight as how salient a sense of belonging to a cultural group was for some children and what their understandings were of the symbolism and the terms of reference associated with their culture. And the comments also reflect a sense of ancestry and belonging in terms of family, culture, and country, and being part of these. For most of the children, being Aboriginal was not about what you do, but rather who you are and who and where you belong to. However, in the last comment on this slide, one child shared their sense of the roles and responsibilities relating to her Aboriginal identity and that she associated with her membership of her cultural group. Before I move to the next slide, I wish to caution the audience that the following excerpts from transcripts contain references to experiences of racism. On this slide, I share some excerpts from conversations had with and among children about their experiences of being Aboriginal. Again, these were prompted by being shown the Aboriginal flag and where the conversations turned to how children understood relationships between skin colour and being Aboriginal. Interestingly, this occurred on several occasions and suggested that children are and have their own particular ways of navigating who and what constitutes being Aboriginal. For the most part, children understood that Aboriginal people can have differing and same skin colours to each other. And it was evident in these conversations that the children did not see being Aboriginal as defined by a particular skin colour. They made assertions that skin colour is not particularly meaningful, as being Aboriginal is more about who you are and where you belong. For several children, being white was part of their narrative of being Aboriginal, and other children expressed their understanding that Aboriginal people can be both black and white. In a way, children's statements about skin colour and what makes someone Aboriginal both resisted and conformed to categorisation according to skin colour. For example, in the first 3 excerpts on this slide, the children assert that Aboriginal people can be white and black, or skin colour and brown. In the second last excerpt, the same child who told her sister she is black and white emphasised that she herself is white in the context of the comment that she knew that some black people get teased. So in the third and fourth excerpt on this slide, children revealed having to navigate the negative perceptions they experienced others to have about black people or black skin colour. The last excerpt in particular highlights how Aboriginal children might deny or project different selves in different contexts and interactions, revealing the situational or contingent nature of their sense of being Aboriginal. And while at one level these children might be considered agentic in that they are ascribing identity for themselves rather than being categorised by others, it remains a concern that the child in this last excerpt has experienced a particular set of new relations marked by racism as they started school, and these are relations that are more likely to disaffirm than affirm the child's sense of being Aboriginal. So on this slide, I would like to present some summary points of my findings. And there are 3 points, and they all focus within the context of transition to school and early years of school. So the first summary point is that most of the children who are identified as Aboriginal or who were identified as Aboriginal at birth arrived at school with a sense of being Aboriginal, fostered in family, community, and early childhood education contexts. Some children and families were still acquiring cultural connections, though, as they started school. And the final point I wanted to note is that it is the case that for both children who do and children who do not self-identify as Aboriginal, schools can support the children's positive sense of self as they accrue cultural connections. On the next slide, I will propose some of the many possible ways in which schools can support children on this journey. So first, we know that the literature tells us that educational settings promote a positive transition to school for Aboriginal children when they acknowledge and value children's cultural identities, and that Aboriginal culture provides Aboriginal children and families with strength and acts as a protective force. So it is vitally important that schools maintain and affirm young Aboriginal children's positive sense of self as an Aboriginal child. And to do this, schools can ensure that the home, community, and early childhood experiences that established and constructed a positive sense of self as Aboriginal are maintained and built on as children start school. And this means attending to continuity of these experiences. And to achieve this continuity, teachers and schools need to know children and their families and their early childhood educators and their community leaders well. And as with all 3 propositions I will offer on this slide, relationships are critical to this. The second proposition arises from the children's narratives of their sense of being Aboriginal, reminding us of the heterogeneity of Aboriginal cultural identities and the complexities of everyday realities for Aboriginal children. Cultural responsiveness at the individual teacher and whole school level is the willingness and capacity to learn from Aboriginal children and families about their unique ways of being Aboriginal. It means being attuned to children as cultural beings to promote their learning, which is inherent to Australian Professional Teaching Standard 1.4. However, cultural responsiveness goes further to understand that being Aboriginal is not necessarily something that can be seen as an aspect of what children do, and that being attuned to children as cultural beings has wider implications for sense of self than just promoting learning. And finally, I want to raise the point and the importance of anti-racism education and anti-bias curriculum approaches being incorporated into early childhood education programs in both early childhood and primary education. The voices of the children in the study remind us of the reality that young children are experiencing racism in our schools. And given the detrimental effects of racism on Aboriginal children and their sense of schools, schools must consider if they can be doing more to eliminate racism. In the stories shared by children, their response to racism was to choose among dual identities or to deny their Aboriginal identity. Aboriginal children choosing to self-determine their own response to racism is described by Moody et al. As part of a bigger picture in schools of underreporting of racism and poor teacher understanding of how racism is being experienced by Aboriginal children. So improvement in both situations, underreporting and teacher understanding, and as was the case with continuity and cultural responsiveness, necessitates trusting relationships between teachers, children, families, and communities, so that all might learn from each other about racism, and that children don't need to take it upon themselves to respond to racism in ways that may disaffirm their sense of self as an Aboriginal child. So on this slide, my references are listed, and this one. And finally, I would like to say Mandanguru, which is thank you in Wiradjuri language.